everybody. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure for us to have you here, and it's a pleasure for the Department of Philosophy to have Professor Tudor Baetu. Tudor is, at the moment, researching in Dean in the Center for the Evolution and Cognition Research. And he will give us a talk about 45 minutes to 50 minutes on the topic, which is right there, the mathematics of mechanics, explanatory pluralism in biology. So, thank you very much. Tudor is from Romania, but lives in Canada, and now it's in Austria, and giving a talk in Brazil. So he speaks different languages, a little bit of Portuguese already, but he will deliver this talk in English. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tudor, and it's your work.
Thanks. So thank you for inviting me. It's my first time to travel to Brazil, so I'm really excited for giving this talk. So just to give you the heads up, my main interest in philosophy is on the epistemology and metaphysics of mechanistic thinking, especially related in science, but in particular in the life sciences. And explanatory pluralism is the new project that I just initiated. And what I'll do today is just discuss a little bit about this new ideas that I have. So I'll begin with what I take to be the premise of my project. I'm talking about explanatory pluralism, the idea that we have different ways of explaining things in science. So in the life sciences, I try to give you just a little overview about this pluralism of explanations. So I grouped explanations in the life sciences in three main categories. One would be the usual causal explanation, causal mechanistic explanations. Of course, everybody is used this idea that you explain a thing by pointing at its cause. Now, as a general rule, one does not have a single cause for a phenomenon. One has some kind of system of causes that's organized in a certain way in order to produce a phenomenon. And in this case, we're talking about the mechanistic explanation. But again, mechanistic explanation is a kind of causal explanation. It's just pointing to a complex cause. Now, functional explanations are maybe grouped in, let's say, the wider category of goal-oriented explanations. So, of course, teleological explanations, kind of explanation that one finds in Aristotelian physics, are this way. They are no longer used today. They are not even in biology. However, this idea that they are preferred states that play an explanatory role is still very important in biology. So, for example, if one would ask, why do living animals have hearts? Because everybody would answer, because the heart is there in order to pump blood. And of course, this is a preferred state in the sense that it's better, the animal is better off with a heart than without a heart. So this would be the functional explanations. And finally, there are something resembling deductive nomological kind of explanation, explanation that that's been developed, for example, by Hampel, this logical positivism. So the idea is that we have mathematical, or nowadays would be computational, derivation of a description of the phenomenon, and this derivations starts from the premises of the laws of biology. There are not that many, but some people believe there are some laws in biology, things like Kleiber's law, this kind of relationship, for example, between mass and metabolic rate. It's much more often to talk about the laws of physics and chemistry, which would entail some kind of reduction of biology to physics and chemistry. But nowadays we'll talk a lot about just a set of rules that describe a system, the behavior of a system. And starting with a very simple set of rules, one can derive a description of a complex whole, usually by means of a mathematical model. So, given this kind of plurality, different kinds of explanation, what I started wondering is that the notion that there are many ways of explaining things in science is really not, it's not really explored by philosophers. Philosophers are very much interested in providing a universal account of explanation. So they start from the premise that there is such a thing as a paradigmatic kind of explanation. They try to characterize it as accurately as possible. And then from there on, the task is one of reduction. The idea is to show how this seemingly diverse spectrum of different kinds of explanations can be reduced to this paradigmatic state. Now, what I want to propose is let's start from the other end. Instead of adopting this kind of monism as a premise, let's adopt, even provisionally, some kind of pluralism. So if we start from this premise of pluralism, which can be a provisionally premise, then we can begin to ask questions that we have not thought asking under a monistic perspective. And we begin to ask, the first obvious question is basically, what is the relationship between different explanations, different scientific explanations of the same phenomenon? For example, can one have a conflict between two different kinds of explanations? And if there is a conflict, then how are this kind of conflicts solved? Do you adopt some kind of pluralism and some kind of mosaic of explanations where different kinds of explanation explain different aspects of the same phenomenon? Or is there such a thing as the best explanation, in which case science aims to upgrade its whole explanatory store to this better kind of explanation? So these are the kind of questions that I'm trying to ask here. And in particular, I'm interested in how mechanistic explanations, which, as I said before, are kind of causal explanations, fit with other kinds of explanations, and in particular with this kind of deductive nomological derivations, mathematical derivations from laws and rules describing the behavior of systems. So this whole notion that there are different kinds of explanations is not really new. Explanations involving laws of nature, explanations involving causes, efficient causes, explanations involving mechanism, explanation involving some kind of preferred state, such as teleological explanations, have been around for a long time. And the interesting thing is that the question of how they fit together and whether you can have conflicts between them has been addressed before. So, as you all know, at the beginning of the early modern period, I'll concentrate on 2 points of tension that begin to crystallize. And one of them is, of course, this conflict between teleological and mechanistic explanations. So, the Aristotelian worldview is abandoned, is replaced by a mechanistic worldview. In as much as biology is concerned, is this idea that you conceptualize living organisms as being some kind of machines that function according to the principle of mechanics. Now, if the mechanistic worldview gained, popularity very, very fast in physics, it didn't happen all that fast in biology. And yes, there were a couple of early successes. Mechanistic explanation of, for example, of blood circulation. So Harvey has a contribution. So some biological phenomena were very, successfully explained in mechanistic terms. But most biological phenomena were not, in particular development. Development was so resistant, it seemed to elude a mechanistic explanation all the way to the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century. We still have a debate between vitalists and mechanists, for example, at the end of 19th century. And the reason is because development seems to be one of those things which is much better explained teleologically. It seems to be a goal. An embryo develops, the goal of an embryo is to develop into an adult. Now, even though teleological explanations were eventually abandoned for good, something did come out of all these debates, and especially if we think, for example, in the afterlight of Kant's critique of judgment. Kant makes two very interesting points. Number one, he talks about the normative aspect associated to the notion of biological function. Well, this is something that we still have today. And the other point that he makes is one about the self-organization of self-regulation of living organisms. And again, these are conceptual tools that play the debate in the development of biology concerning, the origin of life, understanding development, understanding things like homeostasis. So today I'll not concentrate all that much on the self part, but more on the organization part. But before I get to that, let me discuss the other point of tension that crystallized in this early modern period. We have a tension between laws of nature and mechanisms. So it's very interesting that if you read the writings of the early modern mechanists, people like Descartes, La Mettrie, Boerhaave, and even Newton, there's a tension between two distinct understandings of the notion of mechanism. So on one hand, we have this understanding of mechanism as being something that behaves according to the laws and principles of mechanics. So here, I mean, the explanatory burden falls on these laws of mechanics. And on the other hand, we have a different kind of explanations in which the notion of the local organization of matter plays a very important role. And Descartes kind of promoted lots of mechanisms of that sort, this whole idea of a hidden structure that does the explanatory role. And in this case, we're talking about a causal kind of explanation, not as much as a derivation from laws, but more akin to what we call today a mechanistic explanation. And this is very nicely illustrated in the work of Boyle. Everybody knows Boyle. He's famous for his law of ideal gases. Pressure times volume is a constant. Now, the interesting thing is that he thought that the law, for which is known, that bears his name, doesn't do any explanatory role. The law itself is just a mathematical way of speaking. Say it's a mathematical formula, it's a mathematical representation. He thought that what explains the behavior of gases, namely the increase in pressure when you compress the gas, is the hidden structure of the gas. And he imagined this, he's an atomist, he imagined this hidden structure involving atoms linked in a lattice of springs. And he actually thought that the gas has springs. Why do you have an increase in pressure? Well, because if you compress that kind of structure, it opposes the resistance. And this points to a different kind of the different metaphysical view of the world. Unlike Newton, he didn't place the emphasis, the explanatory emphasis on the law, but rather on this kind of hidden structure. He was completely wrong about it, but it's nevertheless interesting. And this brings, as I said, this kind of tension between two distinct understandings of mechanisms. So on one hand, we have this quantitative understanding of mechanisms, which is focused on understanding how a system behaves based on knowledge of the rules that govern the behavior of the parts. And on the other hand, we have a qualitative kind of explanation, which points to the local spatial temporal organization of matter. And this is local, so one is universal, especially if you think about mechanics. The other one is really focused on how the matter is organized here and now, and this plays an explanatory role. And this is important. Why is it important? Because it paved the way to the mechanistic, to the conception of mechanisms and mechanistic explanation that we have today. So nowadays, we think about mechanistic explanations, especially in the life sciences. We don't think about a mechanical explanation per se. Why? Well, two things happened. Number one, this notion of spatial temporal organization of matter was brought at the forefront as one of the characteristics of the main characteristics of mechanisms. And the second point, which is really important, is that mechanisms became independent from the theory of mechanics, classical mechanics, to which they were initially attached. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we talk about a mechanism in biology, probably the first thing that you think about is a molecular mechanism, which is not really a push-pull kind of mechanism, but it's a chemical mechanism. It consists of things interacting at a chemical level. And in more general terms, it includes not only chemical interactions, but also electrostatic interactions. I'll talk about an example of that today. Thermodynamic processes, very, very important, diffusion. And nowadays, we even talk about quantum processes. Currently, photosynthesis and odor perception and even light perception involve some kind of quantum processes. Tunneling, I think it's called. So, this brings us to what's called the new mechanistic philosophy. So this is something that began flourishing about, I would say, 10, 15 years ago. It's extremely popular in philosophy of biology, but it's catching fast in the philosophy of on the metaphysics of causation, for example. And according to this new mechanistic philosophy, a mechanism is defined as an organized system. So they talk about entities and activities which are organized such that they produce a phenomenon. And the phenomenon is usually characterized as regular changes from an initial state of affairs to a final state of affairs. So we have a correlation between A's and B's, where A's come before the B's, and The reason why you have a correlation is because there is a mechanism that mediates the transition from A to B. And, this kind of, the mechanistic explanation itself, it's basically a description of a series of steps that take us from an initial state of affair. So it's a step-by-step description of the how we get from A to B. And in biology, this amounts to this kind of diagrams that you see up there, which is just transcription and translation. So you have some of the entities involved, parts of the mechanism that are depicted, the relative shapes, sizes, positions to one another or to cellular structures. The arrows are very important. They indicate the order of the activities that take place, and some of this text that comes with it describes the activities. And the idea is that if we look at this kind of diagrams, we get some kind of understanding. For example, how we get from a DNA sequence to a protein. The mechanism itself is not that important. Those of you that have a background in biology, you're all familiar with that. If not, you can think about, Stuart Glennon's favorite example of mechanism is a toilet flush. It's a very simple one that everybody can understand, and it involves a steady state. So I became interested in this problem of are mathematical models in biology explanatory? So I think this is an echo of the kind of problems that troubled Boyle. Boyle was interested, as I said before, about this tension between two kinds of explanations, one involving laws of nature and the other ones involving this kind of hidden structures. And why I say that? Well, this debate about the explanatory role of mathematical models in biology, it initially started as a question of reduction. Because this kind of mathematical models involve the laws of physics of chemistry and use these laws of physics and chemistry in order to derive descriptions of biological phenomena. And this was thought to be an example of reductionism. Biology reduces, at least for explanatory purposes. It doesn't have the explanatory resources to explain its own, the kind of phenomena that, biologists are interested in. You need to know some physics and chemistry in order to explain them. But as you'll see, there is more going on there. So let me just say the two kinds of answers that have been offered. So are they explanatory or not? Some people think, yes, they are explanatory. And then the immediate question comes then, what kind of explanations are they? And the answer would invariably involve something along the lines of a didactic nomological kind of explanation. The other camp says, no, they're not explanatory. Why? Well, because didactic nomological explanations, and for that matter, mathematical models as well, don't necessarily reflect the causal structure of the world, and the true explanation, a genuine explanation, should reflect it. Failure to do that means they are not explanatory. They may play an instrumental role. So let me develop a little bit both positions and see how they fit with what really interests me. It's basically what's the relationship between mechanistic explanations and other kinds of explanation in biology. So there is one example that's been discussed in some detail in the philosophical literature, and it's been done by Marcel Weber. So Marcel Weber is a Swiss philosopher of science, of biology in particular. He wrote this wonderful book, The Philosophy of Experimental Biology. And in there, he's a reductionist. And he discusses this particular example. Suppose we're trying to explain action potentials. Action potentials, we all know what they are. Impulses, electrical impulses that travel along the axons of neurons, the basis of all neuronal activity, the basis of all brain activity. So action potentials are a phenomenon that has been described, characterized. It's something that you can measure. And this has been done at about a century ago, the 1900s. And the description of the phenomenon is just this change in voltage. It has a very specific shape. Suppose we're trying to explain that. Well, in the 1950s, so this is 1950s because it's before the era of molecular biology, it's before, the double helix and all that. Two neurophysiologists noticed one thing. There are changes in ion concentrations. And then they thought, if we apply the laws of electron chemistry to these changes in ion concentration across from one side and the other on the membrane, we might be able to explain this phenomenon. So what they did, they started by identifying the relevant laws that describe the behavior of the parts they thought are very important. In this particular case, ions moving from one side to the other of the membrane of the axon. And from there, they constructed a mathematical model, and from this model, they were able to derive, actually analytically, so they did it, pen and paper. They solved the system of differential equations, and one of the solutions was something resembling quite nicely the action potential, the shape of the action, the measured phenomenon. And this was deemed to be an explanation of the phenomenon. Why? Because it showed that, in principle, ions moving across the membrane of the ion can generate action potentials. Why? Because these ions obey the laws of electrochemistry, and it follows from these laws that you get that kind of changes in voltage. And it was deemed to be a major success of neurophysiology, worth a Nobel Prize. So Marcel Weber argues, well, this is why mathematical models are explanatory, because they tell us what kind of laws are really important for understanding a phenomenon. And if we apply these laws, we can derive, not only predict, we can also explain the phenomenon. Now, as you can easily imagine, not everybody is really happy with this kind of answer. Most people, of course, in the causation camp, Wesley Salmon, James Woodward, and in particular Carl Craver. He's a student of Salmon. I don't know, but he applies Salmon. He's a fan of Wesley Salmon. So he argues that no, a satisfactory explanation should capture the causal structure of the phenomenon. The physical structures actually responsible for causing the phenomenon. And the kind of arguments he gives are based on this notion that interventions are very important. Why do we need to know the actual causes of the phenomenon? Well, in order to intervene on them. So people are not that much interested in predicting cancer, but rather in curing them. If you can predict cancer, that's very nice. If you can actually identify the causes, you can intervene on them, and this is what science is all about. And he argues, why are not mathematical models explanatory? Well, because the mere, mathematical or computational derivation of the description of the phenomenon that interests us does not guarantee that the model correctly identifies physical structures that are responsible for actually causing the phenomenon. Why not? Well, here comes the usual kind of complaint. Well, you have, of course, non-interpreted parameters, the kind of, little constants that you introduce in your set of equations that you don't know what they correspond in the real world, but you need them in order to make a derivation. You have idealizations. In this particular case, you have to assume that you have this kind of perfectly, unhindered diffusion, for example. Another problem is you can have many possible models. So you need 2 or more electrical currents in order to generate a kind of change in voltage. But whether it's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, we don't know. They're all empirically adequate. They can all generate a description, fairly accurate description of the phenomenon of interest. Another point of complaint is there are no physical objects, or not that many physical objects, on which one can intervene. And this is linked, of course, with the fact that not all the parameters in the model have a physical interpretation. So yes, the membrane is there, but set aside that, you don't really have anything molecular, anything, especially proteins, for example, things that have a genetic basis on which we can intervene. But the biggest problem is that you have a huge black box in the middle of the model. The model says that you have ions that travel across a membrane that's known to be impermeable. It's an insulator. It doesn't conduce electricity. So, in a sense, you need holes to be formed in the membrane, and these holes need to open and close. And the question is, how can you say that you have an explanation if you don't know how that happens? Seems to be a pretty big hole in the whole story. So, if the mathematical model doesn't explain it, then what does? Well, this does. This is the mechanism behind the action potential. So the idea is that we have a description, a step-by-step description of how this happens. I'm not going to go through the mechanism. It's not really important. What I wanted to show by this picture is that this is a very different kind of thing than the paper and pencil kind of derivation of solving differential equations. It's really a description of physical structures and how they operate over time. And you go from a sequence of very precise sequence of events that takes you from one initial, from the resting potential to the polarization threshold and so on and so forth. Now, as far as the philosopher is concerned, the question remains, if the mathematical model does not play an explanatory role, okay, let's say that's fair enough, then what's the epistemic purpose? And how does it relate to the mechanistic explanation? How the two relate? And Karl Praver has an answer to that. So he says, let's look at the historical development of this particular example. So we start with the description of the phenomenon of interest. In this case, the action potential. This happened at the turn of the century, the other one, 1900s. In the 1950s, Hodgkin and Huxley, the two neurophysiologists that constructed the mathematical model involving the laws of electrochemistry, they show that, in principle, the movement of ions across the membrane of the axon can generate action potential. Why? Because if you apply the laws of electrochemistry to that movement of ions, you get a description of the phenomenon of interest. From there on, the problem was to basically open all the black boxes, and the biggest box was how do those ions travel across the membrane. In the 70s, ion channels. So basically, Hodgkin and Huxley actually postulated that there are ion channels. In the 70s, the ion channels are identified. It turns out they're proteins. That generated one Nobel Prize. And then the question was, how do these things open and close? And that was elucidated very late. It was only in 2001, and again, we have a Nobel Prize for that. So this is the history of science part. The philosophical part, so this is what Karl Praver concludes from here, is that the main contribution of the mathematical model was to guide the discovery process. Basically, the main contribution was that it led to the hypothesizing of ion channels, which are physical structures that play a causal role in this mechanism. Once these structures were hypothesized, this generated a new research project, namely identify those things and figure out how they work out. And as that was done, we're getting closer and closer to the kind of mechanistic explanation that's actually taught in biology textbooks today. So that's his story. That's his answer. Basically, it's a crutch. It's something that people use in order to get to a mechanistic explanation. While they go to the mechanistic explanation, they can get rid of the mathematical model. It doesn't play an epistemic role anymore. So, given this kind of examples, I think that it's absolutely right to claim that the mathematical model cannot really replace a mechanistic explanation. There's much more information in the mechanism than there is in the mathematical model, and this added information plays an explanatory role. On the other hand, does this mean that we can get rid of the mathematical model? Is the reverse true? Does the mechanistic explanation can do everything that the mathematical model does? And Karl Praver says, and other mechanists says, yes. Why? Because of the kind of historical analysis that I just illustrated. You start, what the mathematical model basically is just the backbone of a future mechanism. So it's just a simplified, or if you want, actually an impoverished version of the final mechanistic explanation. So therefore, it would seem reasonable to conclude that since you just keep adding a more and more complete causal and physical interpretation of a mathematical model, it seems only natural to assume that the mechanistic explanation should do everything that the mathematical model does. And I figured out that's not entirely correct. So I do argue in one of the papers actually I sent Sophia, I argue that mathematical models play an explanatory role that is distinct from that of mechanisms. And why do I argue that? It's because I became interested in systems biology. So systems biology is this new thing that happened after 2000. It's a brand new science. It's interested in providing a more holistic approach. Basically, it's interested in providing, number one, putting number of molecular mechanisms, so providing quantitative understanding of biological activity, and also understanding how it's all integrated. And one thing that systems biologists do is that they construct mathematical models of mechanisms that have been already elucidated. And then one question that comes immediately to mind, if we already know what the mechanism is, then is there something else left to be explained? We can understand that they construct a mathematical model. This can be done for a number of practical reasons, for example, for instrumental reasons, just to generate predictions. But is there something left to be explained? And I would argue that yes, there is something to be explained. And in order to show that, I did pretty much what Carl Kraber did, but for modeling. For modeling strategies in systems biology. So in this particular case, you start with the mechanism that's fairly well understood, and we know that this mechanism generates, causally produces a phenomenon, or at the very least is necessary for the, causally speaking, for the production of the phenomenon. So what you actually see here is not really important. It's a mechanism underpinning inflammatory responses. What's happening in your eye right now. So it's actually a negative feedback loop mechanism. It's something that gets turned on. We have an inflammatory response, and it automatically turns itself off. It's like a little bit like a thermostat. There is a negative feedback loop there. So we start with this mechanism. We know it's responsible for a phenomenon, which is a peak of inflammatory response. And two things have to happen before we get to a mathematical model of that. Number one, there's a process of simplification. Why do we do that? Well, keep in mind that the purpose of the mathematical model is to simulate or generate as one of the solutions a description of the phenomenon of interest. So this thing has to be computationally efficient. And one way to make it, the preferred way of making it computationally efficient is to get rid of as many details as possible. So you start by concentrating what you think is the main feature of the mechanism, the negative feedback loop, and you get to that simplified description. So this already tells us that some information is lost in this process. And I showed in one of my papers that with this loss of information comes a loss of explanatory power, in the sense that the simplified schema cannot account for certain details of the phenomenon of interest. So in this sense, the simplified version of the mechanism cannot explain everything that the mechanism can explain. And then exactly the opposite happens. So we lose some information that's present in the mechanistic description, and then we add some information, which is a different kind of information. It usually pertains to assumptions of how the system behaves quantitatively over time. So it's assumptions about the dynamics of the system. So you have extra information, which means there is a potential for explaining certain aspects of the phenomenon of interest, which are not necessarily explained by the initial mechanism. And from there on, you're supposed to get a description of the phenomenon of interest. Sometimes this happens, sometimes this doesn't. Some would argue here that if your mathematical model doesn't succeed in giving you a description of the phenomenon of interest, this means there's something wrong with the mathematical model. This is the first assumption. Why? Because you'd assume this mathematical model is just the impoverished representation of the mechanism. So what you do is usually try to get a more realistic mathematical model. Well, actually, I did the search, and I did an analysis of the scientific literature and papers, published in the scientific literature, like Science and Nature and that kind of top journals. And it's not always the case. Yes, for the most part, people just go back and revise the mathematical models. However, in some cases, instead of revising the mathematical model, they go back to the bench and they look to see if they haven't missed something in the mechanistic explanation. So it's actually a case of underdetermination. Why? And this is explained quite nicely by the fact that there is a loss of information and there is added information. So in a sense, one should not treat the mathematical model and the mechanistic explanation as being just one version or one impoverished version of the other, but actually they are two distinct epistemic entities. So this is what I wanted to say, that they do play an explanatory role that's distinct from that of mechanisms. So there is a consensus that's emerging in the literature. So this is something that I defended, it's something that other philosophers of biology defended as well, namely this idea that mechanisms and mathematical models account for different aspects of the same phenomenon. So they play this distinct explanatory role. So in particular, the mechanistic explanations identify physical structures that are responsible for causing phenomena, and this is usually done by the experimental practices, the kind of stuff that molecular biologists do. Mathematical models, on the other hand, account for these quantitative dynamic features of the phenomenon, and they do that by means of mathematical derivations. So they take account of things about, intensity. So of course you have an activation on the inflammatory response, but the question is, why do you have that much activation and not that much activation? Why do you have this duration as opposed to this other duration? And they address those kind of questions. And the argument here is one of explanatory complementarity, which I like to describe it as being a sort of explanatory mosaic. The idea we have the best explanation is actually a mosaic, where the different pieces of the mosaic involve different kinds of explanation. And this is, of course, in contrast with the traditional approach, which places an emphasis on monism, the idea that explanation is this kind of monolithic unity. It's indivisible. Now, okay, this is all very nice, but what really interests me is basically how the pieces of the mosaic fit together and how one handles, the points of friction. And I'll give you just one explanation, one example, and where this kind of questions becomes really interesting. For example, you may wonder yourself, you may ask yourself, when is the mechanistic explanation complete? This is not an obvious question. There is no obvious answer to this question. So you would argue that it's complete when you include all the relevant features of the mechanism. So you take into account everything that's causally relevant to your phenomenon. And when you have some kind of productive continuity, which means you have a story of a how this happens. How do you get from point A to point B? And this story, intuitively at least, doesn't seem to contain any kind of big gaps. You have these leaps of faith, or black holes, or black boxes, where you don't know exactly what happens. Something happens and they get from one intermediate state to another. So of course this is very nice, but how do you establish? How do you know that you have taken into consideration all the relevant features, that there are no holes in your how story? Now, the argument that I made and Carl Craver made, and this is based basically on Woodward's interventionist account of causation, is that experimental interventions demonstrate that if you interfere with the mechanism in any way or any of its parts, so basically if you destroy the mechanism, then the phenomenon doesn't occur. If you modify the mechanism, then the phenomenon is modified. And this shows that this kind of interventions provides a very nice necessity condition, necessity in the sense of causal necessity. The mechanism is necessary for the production of the phenomenon. Why? If you destroy it, you don't have the phenomenon. It's as simple as that. However, this doesn't address the problem of sufficiency. Is the mechanism sufficient in order to generate the phenomenon of interest? And this links to a number of interrelated problems. Now, the obvious one is that of explanatory completeness. A mechanism being composed of entities and activities that are organized in such a way to produce a phenomenon. Now, those entities, this links to a problem of bottoming out, the problem of infinite detail. Every single entity can be, divisible in sub-entities. This when you start at the biological level. Any activity is made of sub-activities, and ultimately every single mechanism is going to be made of sub-mechanisms. Now the question is, how deep do you need to go in order to say, well, my explanation is complete or sufficiently complete or reasonably complete, at least for the purposes of accounting for the phenomenon that I want to account for. So that's one set of problems. Of course, links with the problem of reductionism. If you need to bottom out very low, then eventually you get some kind of reduction of biology to physics. The other problem is one problem that actually puzzled Kant quite a lot. It's the problem of modularity, of lack thereof. So Kant asked, is it possible basically to decompose a living organism into a set of mechanisms or machines? So if the mechanism is sufficient, then you'd expect that you could take that mechanism out of the context of, the physiological context of the living organism, and the mechanism will do whatever it's doing, just the same. You have a case of modularity. Now, Kant argued that's not possible. A living animal, for example, is an organic whole. It cannot be decomposed in that way. But the question remains in the end, and it links to this notion of sufficiency. Is the mechanism sufficient to produce a phenomenon? Now, what I want to argue is that bringing in mathematical models can provide a way to answer this kind of problems. And how it does it? Well, it provides new norms for evaluating mechanistic explanations. So what I witnessed is a new tendency. When I say new, it's new for me. I finished my degree in biology in 2001, and I was working on the immune responses, the kind of mechanism that I illustrated before. And all you do is experimental work. There is no mathematical modeling involved. I don't know how to do this kind of things. Actually, I attributed them to biochemistry. This is the place where you do this kind of differential equations, this kind of kinetic models. So there's a tendency to complement this kind of qualitative descriptions of mechanisms, which are usually elucidated by the experimental techniques of molecular biology, with mathematical modeling. Another point is, why do they do this kind of modeling? They already have a pretty good idea about what the mechanism is and what the main proteins and genes and all that stuff. Well, the idea is that they want to see if the model, or now one of the model outputs, if you have a computer simulation, you have solutions, then one of the solutions matches the description of the phenomenon of interest. And if they do, this is supposed to give you some evidence that the mechanism can generate, at the very least in principle, assuming that the model is correct, it doesn't involve some crazy idealizations or some kind of erroneous description of the causal structures. So in principle, it can generate the phenomenon of interest in the right amount and intensity. And because it just gives you the right amount and intensity, it means that the mechanism is sufficient. Why? Because it's neither too little nor too much. It's just the right point. If you have other causal contribution, that will overshoot. If you don't have enough causal contribution, you just don't get the right numbers. So two kinds of arguments are made here. So if the model output matches the observations, of course you can have a situation where they don't match the observation, and then you have to revise one of the two things, is the model or the mechanism. But let's assume that they do match. You can make an argument for quantitative sufficiency or modularity. And the argument here is that the proposed mechanism is sufficient to generate the target phenomenon, exactly as it's measured. And this means that if it were possible to take out the mechanism, you'd expect that if it were possible to take out the mechanism from the context of the living cell, of the living organism, or even better, reconstruct it in vitro, by synthetic means, then that mechanism would function just the same and produce a phenomenon of interest in the absence of everything else. And this would provide a solution to the modularity problem. Now, sometimes these kind of arguments is pushed even further, and they have this kind of parameter sufficiency or causal completeness kind of argument. And the argument goes as follows. You have a mathematical model that matches the observation, the description of the phenomenon of interest, and on the top of it you have a quite realistic mathematical model, one in which you don't have uninterpreted parameters. And the argument here is that since you already get a description of the target phenomenon, a more complex phenomenon, which would include additional parameters, to which parameters would correspond different mechanistic parts of the mechanism, is not required. So this means it's concluded from this kind of if you have this kind of nice match between the output of the model and the description of the mechanism, it's taken to be a proof, or at least some evidence, that all the relevant mechanistic components have been taken into consideration. So in other words, the mechanistic explanation is causally complete. You have taken into account all the bits and pieces of the mechanism that are causally relevant for producing that phenomenon. And this is a solution this would provide a solution to the bottoming out problem. For example, if your mechanism, and you have a molecular mechanism, and it allows you, for example, to get the right description of the phenomenon of interest, let's say photosynthesis, it means you don't need to take into account quantum effects. As it turns out, in the case of photosynthesis, you're missing about 3%, and this is when it was hypothesized that you need to go a level lower and take into account this kind of quantum effects. But in the case of most mechanisms, you don't. So this would tell you where to stop, where you should bottom out, in order to take what's causally relevant to the explanation. So, how do the two approaches fit together? How do mathematical models fit with mechanistic explanations? Well, mathematical modeling is basically an attempt to figure out whether there are black boxes left in our current understanding or currently accepted mechanistic explanations. And the argument that we're trying to make here is that one cannot rely on experimentation alone in order to figure out whether the mechanistic explanation is complete. And this links to this notion that experimental intervention gives the necessity condition, but they don't give the sufficiency condition. In order to get the sufficiency conditions, you need to put some numbers on the mechanistic explanation, and in order to do that, you need to construct a mathematical model. And it so turns out that if such black boxes exist, it's not always possible to probe them directly by means of experimental techniques that are available today. And this links to the problem that, as a general rule, it's very hard to measure in vivo concentration of proteins, and it's very hard to measure them in real time, actually, in an artificial system as well. And this is where mathematical models come very, very handy. They allow for at least for proof of principle that the proposed mechanism, as it's understood, is sufficient to generate the phenomenon down to this minute quantitative and dynamic details. And in turn, these proofs of principle, as far on the philosophical side, they provide possible solutions to the problems of explanatory completeness, the problems of bottoming out, and modularity. And this links to the problem of reductionism, as much as bottoming out is concerned, and this problem of this, for example, this debate between mechanicists and organicists, the kind of debates that raged at the end of 19th century, but they still continue today. I mean, there are lots of critics of molecular biology who argue, always appeal to this kind of Kantian arguments to defend more holistic approaches. And then if you can have some means to assess the modularity of the mechanism, then you can have a more clear answer to whether it's possible to take out a mechanism or even decompose the whole organism into a set of independently functioning mechanisms. So this is where I want to take, this is my last slide. So you can breathe now. I can breathe. Thanks. So this is where I want to take my project. So I want to argue for the explanatory role of mathematical models. I think that getting towards to be a consensus. So I'm glad I published on that. Probably it's not going to be that interesting in the future. But this, taking into account these mathematical models, will lead to, I think, two very important things. Number one, they might lead to a revised ontology of mechanisms. Sometimes they said that when you have a mathematical models and the mathematical model fails to give you a description of the phenomenon you're trying to understand, and as I said, as a general rule, you just modify the mathematical models. But sometimes you modify the mechanism. And when you modify it, at least the examples that I've seen in the scientific literature, it goes in a very peculiar way. They go to show that you have two versions of the same mechanisms, or sometimes three or more, that share quite a lot of the same mechanistic components, but they have like this kind of variance concerning some particular component, and it takes the whole thing in order to produce the phenomenon of interest. And this is where this kind of diverges from the current characterizations of mechanism, in particular because we have this kind of population effects that's added. So this is something that I want to look at more closely. Now, the other thing is the norms of mechanistic explanation. How does one evaluate, epistemically speaking, the goodness of a mechanistic explanation? And these norms so far have been established mainly in light of this kind of interventionist account of causation. And what I want to argue is that that's not enough. You need to take into account this kind of mathematical modeling and this idea of derivability, how you derive a description of the behavior of the whole based on understanding of how the parts interact with each other. And hopefully this does have at least a potential practical point of interest. This is namely a revising of the current ranking of mechanistic evidence in evidence-based medicine. So evidence-based medicine is that pyramid over there. So it's basically just the ranking of evidence that a proposed treatment is likely to be beneficial. And this is ranked, the stuff that's ranked very low doesn't matter for much, and the stuff that's on the top counts for a lot. And what counts for a lot are clinical trials. And of course, this is perfectly reasonable. You don't necessarily want to understand how a drug works. It's more important to know that it works, at least from a physician's point of view. Nevertheless, mechanistic evidence, and this is the kind of evidence that comes from basic science, is ranked very low. And this has some negative effects. Basically, dissuades. There's no point in doing basic research since all that matters is do the randomized clinical trials. However, if you have better means to evaluate the goodness of a mechanistic explanation, this may provide at least some arguments for moving that evidence a little bit up the ladder. And this is something that, again, I want to work on. So this is it.
Thank you very much, Tudor. We are open for questions. I ask you to press the button. There is a switch on and switch off button in front of you in order for the voice to be taped as well. So I will help organizing the debate. I have a question. While you think about a question, I will ask a question. Well, I think it was a little bit more than the half of your talk when you start defending the models, mathematical models for understanding systems and mechanisms. In that moment, I had the impression the reason you did that is because it's you can generate a model. That's why it's called mathematical model in terms of computing.
Yes. So there are two kinds of approaches, and the mathematicians are arguing about whether there is such a thing as a computational proof or not. Because mathematicians will say it's only mathematical derivations involve analytic solution, or this kind of computational stuff that involves algorithms is not really a derivation. As far as I'm concerned, I don't really care. It's a principal way of going from a set of premises to a particular set of conclusions. So this is something new. For example, when you talk about the didactic nomological account of explanation, Hampel talked mainly about logical derivation, and this goes in the spirit of logical positivism. Mathematics reduces to first order logic or whatever. They didn't work out, so you have to make space for a much richer kind of mathematics. And nowadays, nobody does things. Mathematical derivation, properly speaking, they use these, software packages.
So I'm right in thinking that you really have to use this modeling by generating computational models for the mechanism. So you can produce some kind of set of rules, mathematical rules, in order to generate the mechanism.
No, you just generate
this computer.
So if you're working like Hawking and Huxley worked actually analytic solutions. It's a set of differential equations, and they solved it by and one of the solutions gives you this. That's as simple as that. Now, when you're using computational simulations, is you choose whatever parameters you want to see how they evolve. For example, what's the dynamics, and that's the output of that. And usually, this output should be a description of the phenomenon you're trying to understand.
Yes, I'm asking this.
So the model may or may not accurately describe how the mechanism works, the insights of the mechanism. It depends how realistic it is.
Yes, but your point is these mathematical models give you some more information than simply the
well,
mechanism. And I'm just wondering if this is the case because you can check in artificial ways the mechanism, which is only possible if you have a mathematical model which can generate computationally the system. Is that the case? I'm getting this.
So, I mean, yes. So you try to understand why you have, so the phenomenon you're trying to explain has some kind of, quantitative aspects attached to it. And you try to explain why those numbers and not others. And this goes back to, for example, the flagpole example. The famous one with the, they said, just because you're able to derive the length of the shadow because the height of the pole because you know the length of the shadow does not count as an explanation, right? You need to take into account the causal structure, which means the light comes from the sun. It's the pole that causes the shadow, and that's fine. That explains that you have a shadow, but it doesn't tell you why the shadow is 20 meters or 25 meters or 1 meter, right? So this is where the mathematics kicks in, and this is where this didactic nomological approach allows you to at least justify the number. And mathematical models work pretty much in the same way. They allow you to understand, at least to provide the justification why those particular values and not other set of values.
But am I right to say that they would be much less informative if we hadn't the computational ability we do have to, in the sense, you see, 80 years ago,
right,
computational or mathematical modeling would be less interesting, less informative than today because we have the computational.
Yeah, so you could construct the model, but it doesn't mean that you have any solutions coming out of it. So this means it would be, yes, it would be very much, pie in the sky in principle. If somebody would sit down and solve all those sets of differential equations, then maybe you'd have, yes. So the renewed interest is precisely because of that. Computation is cheap.
Yeah. In a sense, describing the mechanism is the main explanation we are seeking for. Mathematic modeling today, with the help of computational modeling, help us to improve our description of the reality.
Yes, but the numbers are important. So I can't remember which one was my slide. This one. So in here, this is the inflammatory response. And the funny thing is that it does matter a lot. If this thing is too low, which means you have some kind of immunodeficiency, that's bad. If it's too long, it means you have some kind of allergic or worse autoimmune reaction. So getting the right numbers is important to a large extent. I mean, especially if you design, for example, anti-inflammatory drugs. They should get you from this. They shouldn't get to this. They should get you from this to this. So this is where, you do it by trial and error and see how it works. But it would be nice if you have some kind of model that will give you the perfect concentration that you have to use. You need to reduce, the activity of NF-kappa B or whatever transcriptional activator that you have by that particular percentage. It would be nice to have that kind of very precise kind of control. Of course, it doesn't really exist, but at least you can do the math, and at least in principle, where you should guess, how much you should reduce it, really put a number on it. So there is a huge interest in that.
Just another question. At another point, you said, well, how far should we go in order to be satisfied with our explanation? So in that case, a solution for that problem should be a functional one. In terms, we should go that far as our question, the initial question, required from our investigation. In the sense that there is not a point, independent point. It's completely dependent on the function of the answer you are seeking for.
So I'm trying to objectify. I'm trying to objectify a little bit that, but of course it's going to be dependent on how carefully you describe your phenomenon of interest. If you describe it as mainly a peak or something, and you don't put many numbers, then the mechanistic explanation, just this qualitative description, is going to be enough by definition. Now, as you go back to the phenomenon and you have more sophisticated techniques, and then you calculate, much better, the real time, then it may turn out that the explanation is not complete. You need to take into account more. Here, the mathematical model begins to play a role, right? Now, assuming that it will be possible to fix this and you have as good as it gets, then you could answer, I think, in principle at least, this bottoming out, because this is not going to vary anymore.
I think
it's conditional, so I don't know if it will be possible. But let's say that it will be possible. There is a point where the phenomenon is described as carefully as it can possibly be.
Do we need?
Yes, press the button.
Can I ask?
Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Tudor, well, I'm not sure if I understood all the argument, but there are several aspects of technical sophistication, and I can't. I'm not sure if I understood them correctly, but I understood your argument as a kind of it's not flexible, but you should argue that mathematical models, mathematical modeling, mathematical explanation, and mechanical explanation are not only compatible, but they are mutually, in a sense, necessary. You said that something like this in this paper. There's in the conclusion you said something like this. This does in scientific practice deductive phenomenological, where mathematical model is plainly applied, and mechanistic approach to explanation are not mutually exclusive. The point is that they are complementary. And so there is at bottom, I think, something ontological. It's not a pragmatic, let me say, epistemological or pragmatically, in pragmatic sense of epistemological complementarity. What I think you are saying is that they are necessarily complementary. And, well, this is the part of, this is difficult to, let me say, for me, to say, yes, I agree with you, because there are several points that I said it's difficult to grasp. But my question is why the other alternative, that is, because you presented, let me say, two separated approaches. One of them that say nomological is the bottom, the basic kind of explanation in mathematical explanation is in this side, and mechanistic is other kind, and they are not necessarily compatible. And so there are people that say the nomological is the bottom kind, and the other said that mechanistic is the other bottom kind. And my point is, why not mathematical model? As you said, it's not your point. If I understood, mathematical model hypothesize the existence of physical structures that play a causal role, in a sense of they only like let us say they transitorily they have a temporary they are temporary device for presenting solutions in a space that mechanistic models cannot present an adequate solution. So if we have a mechanistic solution to this kind of situation, we should get rid of the nomological model. So using a no-chemist simplicity principle, well, the nomological is the temporary device. My point is, why not? This is a very good theory. This is not your theory, as I understood. Your theory is not this. Your theory is that we need both kind of explanations. We need to use both kinds of explanation. My thinking is, why not? This is a good alternative to your. I couldn't understand this.
Okay, so there are two threads. So one is the historical thread, and as I said, I started with a little bit of this divide in this original understanding of mechanisms, which is this laws of nature versus hidden structure, and I think that played a very important role in getting to this. But I also think it's also time to bring them together. They started as one, and maybe they should finish as one at some point. Now, the other thread is the way philosophy of science evolved. So it started with the didactic nomological, then the pendulum swung to this causal explanations, and it's a clash, and maybe it's an artificial clash. It's because people that defend these different views argue, but it doesn't mean that science changed in any way because of that. I mean, physicists continue to do whatever they do. If you study mechanics in school, it's still going to be some form of didactic nomological. They try to prove the explanation of some phenomenon is whenever you derive it from the laws of mechanics. Molecular biologists do whatever they do, namely look for, mechanisms, molecular mechanisms. So, in a sense, I mean, I'm responding to the philosophical, and in that particular paper, I'm responding to this philosophical idea that there is a clash between homological and mechanistic explanation. I say, well,
there are artificial clash.
Right. So I said there is no need for clash. They both play an explanatory role.
But you use the example of evidence-based medicine,
right,
as an evidence or an argument, evidence for your position. But I didn't understand why this is. No, because this is not.
No, that's not. No. My point about evidence-based medicine is a question of how do you evaluate mechanistic explanations. And mathematical models allow you to evaluate
of course.
in a different way. It allows you more accurate, I would say. It allows you to answer questions that you would not be able to answer otherwise. And if you evaluate it more correctly, then you can trust them.
Yes.
Better evidence. That's basically going beyond, as opposed to using it as an argument for what I'm saying. Yes.
Okay, Sophia.
Thank you, Tudor, very much for your talk. I learned a lot. Thank you. And it was very interesting. We are studying here this group, Philosophy of Mind. So some of your pictures we had in some slides some weeks ago in our classes because of the synapses.
Oh, I see.
Yes, okay. But I think you are right. I think we need both. We need calculus, and we need a kind of explanation that isn't just an equation or a formula or something like that. And I would say, I don't know if I am simplifying, but I would say this happens because if you calculate or if you solve a scientific problem through a equation, you are just complementing what you observe. And some model you have in your mind about how, for example, planets move, or how molecules interact, and so on. So when you calculate, you have always something else that is in your mind, and not just the calculus. So I would agree with you that you can't just have a mathematical solution or a mathematical explanation. But I disagree with people who would say that if you have the mechanicist explanation, you can just.
So I'm trying to rehabilitate a little bit. So of course, if you're doing just the mathematics, you can have a strictly instrumental, at least in principle. I think it's really hard to construct a purely instrumental model, one in which doesn't reflect at all the reality, but gives you magically, the right kind of results. It's probably impossible. But you have lots of models in which, the mapping on reality is very loose. There are a couple of parameters that correspond to something in reality, and the rest is you fit it precisely so it gives you the right kind of results. And of course, I can defend, say this stuff explains. It's a very thin explanation. You need a solid causal interpretation. But then I said, okay, and I perfectly agree with this, the critiques of the deductive nomological account. It wasn't a complete account. It wasn't, definitive account of explanation. On the other hand, now we do have the causal story. The causal structure is worked out. Now, what's the role of numbers? What is their place? Do they play a role? And I want to argue, yes, they do. They're important for accounting, as I said, all these little details. If you look at your phenomenon more closely, it does have quantitative details, and the quantitative details make a difference. There is a practical difference, but I think it's just a question, this is the phenomenon. It's counterintuitive to say, I explained it, but look, you have all these aspects that don't derive in any way from my explanation. So saying, in that sense, how can you say my explanation is adequate? It should be, if it's an explanation, you should take into account the phenomenon exactly as it's measured, not some kind of loose description, or incomplete description of it, or a very approximate description. But if you take into account the numbers, well, the only way to take into account the numbers, as far as I can think, is basically by means of some kind of mathematical or logical connection. You need them to derive it from other numbers. Therefore, you need some kind of mathematical model.
Yes, maybe one day we will have a unified language, but not yet.
Not yet, yes.
Yes. Well, I have one more question. And the question would be, the discussion seems to make much more sense when you discuss research in biology. Because, of course, when you discuss research in physics, so almost, the thing you have is mathematical modeling.
Right.
So you can't get rid of that.
No, and it's much more integrated.
Yes, and the question is just exploratory question. Why is that? Is that because the structures in physics are so small, so we have absolutely no direct contact with the structures, with the mechanisms, so we have to be satisfied with the models, and while in the biology we do have access to the mechanisms, and mathematics can help us to decouple these mechanisms in little pieces, but in physics it's not the case. Would you agree with that?
Probably true to some extent. Although some people would see the other way around. They would say, well, finally, biology is becoming a serious science.
With mathematical modeling.
Right. So some people view it as, they view systems biology as being basically the natural progression of science. We're finally going, the way it was supposed to go from the beginning, the way physics works. Solid mathematics. But yeah, maybe it's just an artifact of the fact that, the experimental techniques evolved faster than the mathematics. And maybe it has something to do with what you said about computers. Many of these models are not really that new. So they were in biochemistry for a long time. And biochemistry viewed as applied chemistry, things like physical chemistry. It's just that they were, the systems of equations become very, unmanageable very fast. So we work with very simple chemical reactions. And people did work out some of these models. And they didn't say we're doing systems biology. They didn't say we're doing this kind of new science. They're just doing basic biochemistry. Nowadays, it's probably, the complexity of the equations is no longer such a big issue. Maybe it's just, it's because of computers we can do it, therefore we do it.
But would you agree that in biology, in fact, we need something looking from the other,
right?
From the other side. In biology, perhaps if we had only mathematical modeling, we would still need something else, which is not we only have the mechanisms. We still need something else in order to explain the whole thing. Kind of things like, as you said, the functionality, all that is important.
Right.
As an explanatory
role, yes.
Role.
And in this case, as I said, one of the arguments I'm trying to make is that mathematical modeling is actually trying to get to things that cannot be measured experimentally very easily. The dynamics of the system is a little bit like particle physics. It's something that's very hard to actually access. You can measure, like in steady states, whenever you have this stable states, and then you can measure things like concentration is fine. But to measure actually these transition states, they happen very fast. Not really, not yet.
So now I get it. So you think that the dynamics, which is very much important in biology,
right,
can be better explained with.
Right. For at least for the moment, the mathematical models are the best tool. Because direct measurements and experimentation is absent. There's something where you cannot go very far.
Because perhaps the same scheme could be applied to social interaction. I'm thinking this next level, when we also use mathematical modeling, and I think they are very abstract, and sometimes the parameters are not very clear, and they are very artificial, but perhaps one aspect of the dynamics would be better explained. It's interesting.
Perhaps more even at the macro scale. You can understand how two individuals interact, but it's very hard to predict how the whole population will.
System
right.
Theory.
And there you do.
Well,
I think Craver is right.
Good.
I'm not sure that you refuted his position that mathematical model is not
Expensive.
Mechanism laboratory find a debate from Carl Craver here. I think this is the complication.
The good position. He has a very interesting position.
It's ontologically better. It fits the world better than Craver position. Mathematics is simply a device for temporary device. That's it.
So I think the reason he rejects mathematical models is because he adopts Wesley Salmon's account of causation, and this is an ontological account of causation where he says what does the explanatory thing is actually the real thing. the thing in the causal nexus. It's not the description of the thing. It's actually the actual cause.
He's a realist.
Yeah, he's a weird kind of realist because he doesn't have the sense of it. But it's fairly influential account of causation, and that might be part of the reason, because the mathematical thing is definitely a description of thing unless you want to somehow put it in the reality.
You are a crazy
And
Platonist.
You're some kind of Platonist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one consequence of that is that he has to reject mathematical models because he's looking at
The real thing.
But you have to make some assumptions about ontology, and this is always risky.
Well. Okay. Thank you very much, Tudor, and thank you for the audience. Thank you very much. That's very nice.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I learned a lot. And it was really,
I hope it wasn't warm weather. Canada. Very warm. Yeah.
Please say we don't have winter at all.
No, this is Canadian summer.
Which means he's very happy with the warm weather.
It's very difficult to make questions. But I like your work. Thanks. Thanks. I hope this is not much. Is there? You have a?
No, very good. Thanks. No, this is I have one on WordPress. I have another one. But if you, for instance, read typing mechanism accounts of explanation. Yes, and they have the relationship between mechanical explanations and causal account of the norms of mechanical Right. Auto melhorando.
Mas definitivamente só voltou quando a mas a computação tem isso.
Se todo mundo que trabalha com computação
Windows Phone está fazendo sucesso agora de Windows coreano. O cara
não, que eles falaram do Windows Phone que dá menos problema. Eles terminaram vendo dos aplicativos, ele é menos divertido que um Apple. Mas ele é rápido e ele é mais estável. Os computadores mais novos. Esse meu aqui, por exemplo, eu ligo não chegou ainda. Eu comprei. Eu tinha aqueles fontes de milhagem, tem e
você não tem um Apple, mesmo que vai ser um Apple Phone.
Exatamente.
Tem que mudar tudo. Eu acho que esse dia dele, essa característica,
eu vou perguntar se já está online. Se tiver, não pode Ah, os 50? Então não é o 52, mas tem dois ou 10 aqui. Não tem, só tem que achar um tema, tem que achar um tema, faça os alunos da graduação para aprender, para Ele chamou gente, chamou professor, ele eu acho que eu estava aí até o final.
Tem que ver quem é o coordenador, né? Pra ver como é que funciona isso, né?
Mas eu achei a ideia
porque era uma lógica, ele pegou o professor, chamou pra... A gente foi bem traidor, em vez do João, chamou da casa. Chamou lá de Caxias.
É bom a gente saber que eles consideram a posição.
Eu fui, porque eu disse, eu quero dar lógica e não me chamaram.
A senhora quer da loja? Ela quer da loja.
Bom, você que a professora quer dar um mini curso de lógica?
Agora esses moleques vão me largar serviço.
Não, mas então, mas isso... Não, relação por e-mail. Eu acho que tem que pensar nos alunos, né? Nós tivemos aula, por exemplo, foi bom. Humanidade, né? Lógico, lá em Buenos Aires, lá.
Ai, eles são ótimos.
Várias coisas. Mas tem que ter, sei lá quanto. 500 mil alunos.
Lógico que tem 4.
Sabe, né, que 500 mil alunos. 500 mil. E aí eles têm essas cátedras. Eles dirigem a cátedra dos assistentes. Agora nele já é junto. Não, aula. Aí eles unificam, eles têm apostila, sim. Mas pensem, organizem, e aí a gente vai falando, né? Tá. Depois eu dou para vocês os textos.
Bye.
Tchau.
Mudar?
Mas eu não sabia.
Yes?
Não.
No. But I wanted to ask how many from this, especially for
Because typically the only problem has the European system is basically everybody can get in and people just get forced out. In the US, English is very hard to get in, but until recently, only but it used to be English everybody. Immigration. And everybody education is not a job.
Everybody enters in the university. In Buenos Aires, in the University of Buenos Aires, you have 500,000
500,000 people, 500,000 students.
Oh my God.
It's huge.
It's huge.
It's a city. It's a large city.
Everybody for a dollar and a half.
But because of that, you have the cathedrals, you have professors, and then you have the assistants and all, and they must select. So in the first and the second year, they select.
Demographic, in the sense that it's not that you afford political work, it's so expensive that you begin to get selected. And then the selection, you don't have the vote and select.
I know, yeah, that's right. I don't know if you heard that Argentina and Uruguay, they have their educational system in Latin America for many years, yeah. I can say that. I don't know how similar, I don't know. But that's very good. Also fundamental. Yes, yeah. I think they are, still are, they still read more than we do. And the conversation
A gente está salvando todos iguais. Está sempre salvo aqui, então. Se quiser, só dar uma ligadinha lá. Quem estiver lá, para a gente vir aqui.
Aí a gente faz o...
Pega junto também. Beleza. Valeu, gente. Tchau, tchau.